So the class is Archaeology in the Bible. In archaeology, it's important for biblical studies in a number of indirect ways. It not only shines light on the geographical and cultural and political and religious backgrounds of text, but it also helps in our understanding of biblical languages, where you get a cognate language from which related to Hebrew, and we might be able to get some insight into that. It helps us in textual criticism, where we unearth ancient manuscripts that will help us determine what was the original text. It helps us in all of those ways. And here are some texts that have been uncovered that are very important in those indirect ways. And the first, you see, I think also has some direct importance, and I'll talk about that later. But you see the Amarna letters, which are discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt. The Ebla tablets discovered at Tel Mardik in Syria. The Mari tablets at Tel Hariri in Syria. The Nuzi tablets at Yorgum Tepe in Iraq, the Ugarit archives at Ras Shamra in Syria, the Bogoskoy tablets in Turkey, and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And you have the silver amulet scrolls discovered in Jerusalem, and fairly recently the burnt Leviticus scroll at En Gedi. So all of those have this indirect importance. And as you can see, archaeological sites, they're often called tells. You see, like Tel El Marna, Tel Mardik, Tel Hariri. They're called tells. If it's Arabic, sometimes it will be called a tall, T-A-L-L. But they're often called tells, and a tell is just a hill or a mound that has been built up over many years of successive occupation at a site. Here's how the Encyclopedia Britannica tells it. It says, tell, hill or small elevation, in Middle Eastern archaeology, a raised mound marking the site of an ancient city. The shape of a tell is generally that of a low truncated cone. So you have this, it's kind of flat at the top, you see. It's not like, but it comes up as a mound and then kind of flat there. So it says, in ancient times, houses were constructed of piled up mud, lumps of clay pressed together, or later sun-dried or kiln-baked bricks strengthened with straw, gravel, or potsherds. All mud structures, however, crumble easily when exposed to the elements, and that feature, combined with repeated wholesale destruction from man-made or natural causes, made repairs and rebuildings frequent. Earlier debris was simply leveled off and new buildings were erected on top of it. Thus, most tells are stratified, with the lower strata usually being older than those above them. So you have in this mound of this ancient city, it's like a layer cake. So when you cut down through it, you have all these layers of occupation. The lower layers is going to be the older. And so that's just a little bit of background. Now, my focus in the class is on archaeological finds that have a more direct connection with the Bible. There's all of these indirect significant purposes for archaeology or relevance for biblical studies, but I'm going to be focusing on more direct things. I'm concentrating on finds that have a connection to specific people, places, and events mentioned in Scripture. So I don't include the many discoveries of biblical cities and towns and people groups unless there's something about those cities, towns, or people groups that in my judgment makes them particularly noteworthy with regard to Scripture. So I'm culling things and, curating for you what I think are the most interesting and pertinent things for the Bible. And I'll begin with finds or sites that are relevant to the patriarchal period. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that range. And then we'll just move chronologically all the way through the New Testament into the early church. So we'll be talking about all those. Now here is a standard biblical chronology. A common chronology. Doesn't mean you won't find somebody who wants to argue about something. People want to argue about everything. But this is a standard chronology here. And it's important to understand or to have some kind of biblical chronology if you're going to look at archaeology to make it relevant to the Bible, because if I don't know when events are occurring in the Bible, I don't know how to synchronize what I'm finding archaeologically with the biblical story. So I have to have some kind of biblical chronology to make the archaeology relevant to the Bible. And so this is a standard biblical chronology, and because it's important for integrating or synchronizing archaeology, I want to explain to you briefly how we get this so you can be confident that this is in fact an accurate chronology. And a very important peg for this or data point is that King Solomon began to build the temple in Jerusalem in the year 966 BC. Now, knowing that, I'm able to determine a lot of other things. And you say, okay, that makes sense, I see that, but how do you know? Why do you think that King Solomon began to build the temple in 966 BC? Well, it's a little journey, but I'm going to take you through it because I want you to have confidence in the chronology. The Battle of Karkar is a famous battle in history in which the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, he fought against a coalition of forces. And that battle can be reliably dated to 853 BC. And you say, well, how can that battle be reliably dated to 853 BC? Well, a key to that dating is that in Assyrian records, we are told that there was a solar eclipse in Assyria in the 9th year of the reign of Ashur-dan III. So we can then run the celestial mechanics backwards until we can determine when was it that the moon was right between the sun and the earth so as to cast that perfect shadow, that solar eclipse in Assyria. And when we do that, we determine that that eclipse occurred on June 15th, 763 BC. So now I know that the 9th year of Ashur-dan III was 763 BC. So you see, I have this chain, a chronology of these Assyrian kings. You have, King A reigned this long, King B this long, King C, King D. But I don't know the absolute dating. I don't know where to put it, because this is all relative dating. He reigned this long, he reigned this long, this long, this long, this long. But now that I know the 9th year of Ashur-dan III is 763 BC, now I know where to stick it. So I can plug it in here. And once I'm able to do that, I can then go backward in the chronology to when did Shalmaneser III reign. And so I determine then when Shalmaneser III reigned, and he tells me the year of his reign in which the Battle of Karkar occurred. So now I can be confident that the Battle of Karkar occurred in 853 BC. So that's how we get to that. So that now has set me for the absolute dating for the Assyrians. But how do I jump over and connect this to Israel and Judah? And you see, we know that Ahab was ruling as the king of Israel during the Battle of Karkar. And we know that because Shalmaneser names Ahab as one of his opponents in that battle. He does that in the annals of his campaign, what is known as the Stela of Shalmaneser III, also known as the Kirk Stela. And I'll talk about that later. But he lets us know that in 853 BC, in the Battle of Karkar, that Ahab is the king of Israel because he's one of his opponents. And then we know that from another artifact called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, that in a military campaign that was conducted in his 18th year, which is 841 BC, he says that King Jehu paid him tribute. So we know that at 853, Ahab, during the Battle of Karkar, is king of Israel. We know that in 841, Jehu is king of Israel. And we know from 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, that 12 years separated their reigns. And you see that was when Jehoram reigned. So there's 12 years between the reign of Ahab and the reign of Jehu. We know that that Ahab is on the throne in 853, Jehu is on the throne in 841, so that means 853 is the last year of Ahab's reign, and 841 is the first year of Jehu's reign, because 12 years separates their reigns. So now I have absolute dates for them, and I can just take this chronology of Israelite kings and just adjust it now and stick it into where it belongs. And when I do that, I now have an absolute date. I can then go backwards in the chronology and I can determine, when did Jeroboam reign? Jeroboam was the first king of Israel. You remember Jeroboam came to the throne after the United Kingdom split, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. The first king is Jeroboam. And I can go back and I can determine, okay, Jeroboam began his reign as the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel in 931 or 930. We're going to use 930. So he begins his reign there. And we'd say, well, all right, well, how do I now make contact with Judah? I've got the Assyrians, I've got Israel, how about Judah? Well, we know that when Jeroboam came to the throne as king of Israel in the northern kingdom in 931, 930, that was the year Solomon died. That's what triggered the split. Solomon dies, the kingdom is split. Jeroboam becomes the king to the north, Rehoboam the king of Judah. And so Solomon dies in 930. Now, I know that from 1 Kings 11:42 that Solomon began his reign in 970 because he reigned for 40 years. I know he died in 930. He reigned for 40 years, so he came to the throne in 970. So that's how you figure that out. And then 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says Solomon began to build the temple in the 4th year of his reign. He began to reign in 970. The 4th year of his reign is 966. That's how we get that data point. Okay, and that's very important because with that data point, I'm now able to determine that the Exodus occurred in 1446. Okay, well, how do I know that? Well, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says that Solomon began to build the temple 480 years after the Exodus. So he began to build the temple in 966. 480 years before that is 1446. So I now know when the Exodus occurred, and that's significant. And I also am then able to determine the beginning of Israel's sojourn. When did the Israelites go into Egypt? When did Jacob and his family migrate into Egypt? And Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 to 41 specifies that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years before the Exodus. So I know that the Exodus was in 1446, 430 years before that, 1876. That's when Jacob and his family went into Egypt. So I then have that clear. And then I can determine all part of this chronology of Abraham's birth. Because you see in Genesis 47:9, it says Jacob was 130 when he went into Egypt. Okay, so he's 130 in the year 1876. That means he was born in 2006. Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born in 2006. So he was born in 2066. And then Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born in 2066. So he was born in 2166. All right, that's how you get that. And that's why and how that becomes the standard chronology. Okay, so I want you to understand that. So that's what I believe is right. I think this is the correct chronology. This is how things are. And then from that, we can then look at and plug things in archaeologically. And that gives us a way to do that. All right, speaking of Abraham, his family tomb. You know, the cave or the field of Machpelah, that's the burial place of at least Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. You see all of that in Genesis. Now, Rachel, you may recall, she wasn't buried there because of her sudden death during childbirth near Bethlehem. You see in Genesis 35:19. But this tomb, this cave or field of Machpelah, is very likely in Hebron, at the site of the Muslim mosque that is known as Haram el-Khalil. This mosque sits on top of that tomb. And that's very likely the case. You say, well, why do you think that? Well, in the 1st century BC, over 2,000 years ago, King Herod, right, he wants to ingratiate himself with the Jews because he's an Idumean. But he's made king and ruler. He wants to, hey, I'm with you guys. I'm down with you. So he wants to ingratiate himself with them. And he built an enclosure wall around this area, and he erected monuments there in honor of the patriarchal figures. So he's doing that. You say, well, wait, King Herod, even though it's the 1st century BC, that's a long time after Abraham, and it is. But these kinds of things tend to stick in cultural and social memory. You see, for a long time, as people occupy that same site, they know and pass down, where is this cave? Where is this burial place of all of these great people in the past? Our forefathers. And so it was known, and that's why Herod could build it there and get points for it. Because everybody knows he's building it there because that's the site. Now, the underground chambers where the patriarchal figures would have been entombed, those chambers have received little investigation. The first recorded exploration of the cave, may have been others, but the first we have any knowledge of was by Augustinian monks in the year 1119. So they were there exploring, and they made notes of that. And then it's not again until 1967, after the 6-Day War in Israel, that Moshe Dayan lowered a 12-year-old girl with a flashlight down into the underground chamber. And she described an arrangement that was very similar to what the Augustinian monks had reported in 1119. So, I'd like more about that, but I'm pretty confident that is the burial place. That is the cave of Machpelah, but we haven't been able to get down there and do anything. And I don't know that we should, really. But, so you have that. Then you have a mention of Abraham. In 1825, just 200 years ago, in 1825, there was an inscription dating to about 925 BC. There's an inscription from Egypt that was found at a temple of Ammon, one of the Egyptian gods, found there at a temple in Thebes, which is modern Luxor. And this inscription, it's an inscription of the pharaoh Shishak. He's also called Shoshenq I. And in that inscription, he's bragging about places in Israel and Judah that he had conquered. So he's giving you names of places. And he says, Kenneth Kitchen, or K.A. Kitchen, who's a very famous Egyptologist, he says, the only suggested extra-biblical mention of Abraham is in the topographical list of Shoshenq I, Shishak of Egypt, in 925. Giving what may be read as the enclosure of Abraham, and which is fairly widely accepted. In other words, that understanding and interpretation of that inscription is fairly widely accepted, that that's what it says. He says it's not absolutely certain. It could be interpreted enclosure of the stallions, although the Negev region where this place was located is not exactly famous for horses. However, the Negev is mentioned as one of Abraham's haunts, which would well fit with a place being named after him. And you see, here's the Negev. I got this. Yeah, you see the Negev region up here, right? Jerusalem way up here. This is not exactly a hot spot for horses, but this Abraham was stomping around there. And so what the significance is that we have in 925 BC, this Pharaoh is giving us the name of an area there, and it had been named and was known as the enclosure or the field of Abraham. Now, why would that be? Well, Abraham lived long before, but this is named in his honor, right? Because Abraham's such a figure. And so you have that, and that's something I think that is worth noting and significant. Now, the plains of the city. Plains of the city. You have Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar, which is also known as Bela. Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar, Admah, and Zeboim. These 5 cities are known as the 5 plains of the cities that Scripture locates in the plain on the eastern and southern side of the Dead Sea. Okay, I know some people contest that, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But I think Scripture gives us these points you see here and some other things. The cities are east of Gaza, you see in Genesis chapter 10, verse 19. And there it's giving us the southern boundary of Canaan. And so I think it means due east. It doesn't simply mean it's anywhere east. It's giving a boundary line. And so it's not, it's this way. And so I think it's due east, and that fits with Gaza. You see here at the southern or the bottom of the Dead Sea. It's associated with the Dead Sea, these cities of the plain you see in Genesis 14 and verses 3, 8, and 10. These cities are south of Jerusalem. And I think that's very important. You see in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 46, it seems clear to me that Sodom is located south of Jerusalem. Okay, not north of Jerusalem. And it's south of Mount Nebo. You see in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 3, verses 1 through 3. Okay, now these cities, they are mentioned in the narratives involving Abraham and Lot. Right, in Genesis 13 and 14, Genesis 18 and 19, where you see these cities of the plain. And the oldest map that is known of the Holy Land, it is a mosaic floor map. So, they put the little tiles together. And it was discovered at a church in Madaba, Jordan. And that floor map dates to the middle 500s. And that map locates Zoar at the bottom and the eastern side of the Dead Sea. So that's pretty good evidence that we have of the location of these cities. Both Josephus and Eusebius, Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, Eusebius, late 3rd, early 4th century Christian historian, both of them locate Zoar on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. Okay, so I think this is the region. In fact, I think it was the 1920s when the archaeological team went down there looking for the first time. That's why they looked right down here, is because they thought all the biblical data pointed to this, and we had the map and these other things that, or these other historians who were saying that. So these cities, most likely, in my judgment, they most likely are the modern sites of Babadra, Numera, Safi, Haifa, and Canazir. You see here on the southeast side, east and south of the Dead Sea. I think those are the sites, all of which appear to have been occupied around the time of Abraham. Right, so that would be critical, because if they weren't occupied around the time of Abraham, they can't be the cities we're talking about. But all of these appear to have been occupied at that time. Now, you'll recall that Genesis chapter 19 reports that 2 angels appearing as men, they went to the city of Sodom, and Lot then received them and took them into his home. And when the men of Sodom sought to rape them, well, the angels blinded those people, and then the next day they escorted Lot, his wife, and their 2 daughters out of the city. Because as God's agents, they were about to destroy the city. And Lot was allowed to flee to the small nearby city of Zoar. Okay, this is Sodom. He's allowed to flee to the small nearby city of Zoar, which the angels promised would not be destroyed. Okay, we're going to smoke this place. I want to go, okay, you can go there and you'll be all right. And then he stayed there for a bit, but then he goes to up in the cave in the mountain. But he goes to that city. And then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire, and overthrew the valley, meaning destroyed all of the cities other than Zoar, which the angels had said would not be destroyed. All right, so that's Genesis chapter 19, verses 24 and 25. Now, archaeology indicates that 4 of these 5 cities were destroyed probably around the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, right at the time of Abraham. Okay? Right at the time of Abraham, these cities are destroyed. And the one that was, so 4 of the 5 were destroyed around the time of Abraham, and the one that was not destroyed has been positively identified as Zoar. Okay, it's identified as Zoar not only by the Madaba map that shows where Zoar is, but definitively identified that way by inscriptions on Byzantine Greek headstones in the cemetery at the place, naming the place as Zoar. Okay, so I find it just really interesting. I've got 4 of the 5 cities are smoked during the time of Abraham, and the one city that the angel said wouldn't be smoked wasn't. Okay, so I find that interesting. Now, archaeologist Titus Kennedy, he's a doctorate in archaeology, University of South Africa. He's an adjunct professor of archaeology at Biola University, but he's a field archaeologist, so he spends most of his time out grunting around. You know, he's a field archaeologist, but archaeologist Titus Kennedy, he says of Babadra, he says, the manner of destruction, however, is one of the most unique findings that suggests the identification of Babadra with Sodom. Not only was there evidence of extensive burning excavated at that site and flammable sulfur balls. Now you can go pick up at this site, pick up these sulfur balls, and they still light on fire. So here at the site we have extensive burning, excavated at the site, and flammable sulfur balls found around the area. But the cemetery at Babadra revealed possible information about the populace and fate of the city. A startling discovery made during the examination of tombs at the cemetery was that the charnel houses, repositories for bones or dead bodies, had been burned on the inside, which seemed odd because the cemetery was a sacred area. Initially, it was hypothesized that the burning may have been periodically done inside to cleanse the tombs. Yet upon further analysis, especially from tomb A22, the fire seemed to have started on top of the roofs and then fallen down into the structures, burning the insides of the walls. This phenomenon correlates with the description that fire rained down from the sky onto Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding area, further suggesting the possibility that evidence for the destruction of Sodom has been found. Genesis 19:24. Now, archaeologist Joel Kramer. Let me talk about Gomorrah. Okay, after the destruction, Sodom, or this city that we're seeing, Babadra, was uninhabited. And Numera, you see Numera, this little bit to the south, about 8 miles to the south of Babadra. And that's a good candidate for the city of Gomorrah. And quoting Titus Kennedy again, Kennedy says, excavations at Numera discovered houses, a winery, fortifications, and signs of fiery destruction with ruined buildings and a layer of burnt material at least 30 centimeters, that's about a foot, at least 30 centimeters thick. When sections of the city were excavated, discoveries such as complete pottery vessels, textiles, rope, axe heads, sickle blades, grinding stones, and ovens were uncovered, indicating the sudden destruction of the city and its residents. The scale of the destruction was evident not only from the fire in a collapsed tower, but from human bone fragments found in various areas of the destruction layer, including 2 complete human skeletons in the debris of the tower, which suggests significant loss of life. Comparison with findings at Babadra indicate the 2 cities suffered a destruction and burning around the same time. Numera was never rebuilt and remained an abandoned ruin. So here we have these 2 cities close together at the same time, fiery destruction. Now the archaeologist Joel Kramer, he says that geologists who worked at the excavations of Babadra and Numera, these geologists called Clapp and Donahue, he says Clapp and Donahue concluded that there was an earthquake that then ignited and brought up the sulfur, kind of like popcorn, and caught it on fire, and that it came raining down. And also the petroleum and bitumen that was in the ground came up. That was their explanation for how these cities got burned through a natural disaster. So these geologists are looking and they're saying, yeah, clearly they got burned this way. Now they're saying it was just a natural thing. It was just something that we had an earthquake, up comes these sulfur balls burning everything down. But at least they're recognizing that this is the means of the destruction of the cities we're looking at. All right, so I say, can you argue? But you can argue about everything. If you've lived long, you know this. But I'm saying this to me is intriguing. That these people, that you wind up seeing these things and having this kind of stuff. Now, there are archaeologists who take the biblical account seriously, who resist the identification of Babadra and Numera as Sodom and Gomorrah. They don't like it. They think it's wrong. And they base that mainly because they believe that radiocarbon dating places the destruction of those cities before the time of Abraham. So they wouldn't have been inhabited at the time of Abraham. Well, if that was true, well, then that would be right. But that's just putting too much stock in the radiocarbon dating, particularly how ambiguous it is in the ancient Near East. Okay, this is a known thing, right? Now, those who reject that Babadra and Numera are the best candidates for Sodom and Gomorrah typically will look north. They look to a place called Tal el Hammam. And I just think that has biblical, chronological difficulties that persuade me that you're looking in the wrong place, because I'm convinced Scripture, for example, says Sodom is south of Jerusalem, and this place is north of Jerusalem. Okay? But here's what Titus Kennedy says with regard to the radiocarbon stuff. And I'll say more about this when we get to Jericho. Okay, this will be relevant then. I'll say some more about the difficulty you have with radiocarbon dating in this part of the world. But he says calibrated radiocarbon dates for the region, however, are still being adjusted and understood and should not be used to overturn the evidence from the dated pottery discovered at the sites. See, pottery's king with these archaeologists. They prefer dating on that. They find it more reliable. You see, because they know styles change, and they've studied this stuff long enough that they can identify. An example I used years ago when I taught the class was like if you found a Corvette Stingray, not just a Vet, a Stingray, okay, done in whatever year it was, 63 when they came out. And I've got some layer of, well, I would know. Okay, I could look at this and say, okay, this Corvette Stingray here, I have a good idea of the date. And you wind up telling me, well, that's in 1800. I mean, or you may put it back somewhere else. That's in 1940. I'm going, well, no, it's not, because I know the styles. That style wasn't there. So pottery's king in this dating stuff. And so you can't just so quickly say, well, the radiocarbon dating, that's it. That's it. And that's what people do. Anyway, he goes on and says, should not be used to overturn the evidence from the dated pottery discovered at the sites. Therefore, it is plausible that the destruction occurred sometime around 1900 BC. He wrote this in 2023, when the biblical chronology associated with Abraham places the obliteration of Sodom and Gomorrah. So they look like really good candidates to me. Really good candidates there for Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, so that's what I have on Abraham. There's not a lot there. Okay? You have the cave of Machpelah, you have the Shishak inscription, you have the cities of the plain. Now I next want to move to this section of the Israel's sojourn in Egypt. Okay, their time there in Egypt. As I say, we have this chronology. We can securely date these historical events, derive these absolute dates from Scripture, involving the patriarchs, the Exodus, all of that, and with less certainty can also establish an absolute chronology for the reigns of various Egyptian pharaohs. So we can also get dates for the Egyptian pharaohs. And the archaeologist Douglas Petrovich, so this is his chronology here, and Petrovich got his doctorate in archaeology at the University of Toronto. His minor's in hieroglyphics. He's studied this stuff for decades, published many things. Now, he's a Bible believer. See, so in the way this works is, if you're a Bible believer, I don't care how educated you are, how sophisticated you are, they look at you like you're a bumpkin. Okay? But he knows that. But you see, but he believes the Bible, and he looks at things through Bible lenses, but he's careful and he's trained. And so he has gone through and he has argues in detail. Okay, he doesn't simply say, I wish this was the case. He argues in detail for an Egyptian chronology that fits neatly with the biblical storyline, and this is that chronology. Now, I'll blow it up a little bit so you don't go blind. But I had to do it. I wanted first to show you that you see over here, you've got the reign and the Pharaoh, and then I have that gap in the top because I'm going to put them together with the biblical chronology. But anyway, I blow it up. Just let me talk about it a little bit now. So it's important to understand that Petrovich's Egyptian chronology is within the bounds of mainstream archaeology and Egyptology. Okay, in other words, he's not like one of those guys like David Roll or John Bimson, one of those guys who argue that the conventional Egyptian timeline is radically skewed, that it's off by hundreds of years. Now, those are bright, educated guys, and they make their case. But they haven't convinced many people. I'm saying Petrovich isn't one of those guys. He's very close to the normal accepted Egyptian timeline. He presents historical evidence for dating the reigns of the pharaohs within the generally accepted framework for Egyptian history. All of the dates that he has are plausible. And all of those dates would find support among mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists. For example, his reigns of the 18th dynasty that you see there, they vary by only a few years from the reigns that are given in the Cambridge Ancient History, which, as Eugene Merrill says, quote, is a publication produced by impartial scholars and recognized as impeccable authority. So here you have that, and he's just tweaking these things just a few years. Just give you an example of what I'm talking about. Richard Laubin, he's a professor of anthropology and African studies at Rhode Island College. Well, he dates the reign of this key figure, Amenhotep II. He dates his reign from 1453 or 1450 to 1425 or 1419. Okay, so he's at 1453, 1419. Petrovich is 1453 to 1416. Okay, so you see what we're talking about. We're tweaking. But he doesn't tweak just because he wants to. He argues for it. And when I post this on, you'll be able to have access to Petrovich's papers. You can go knock yourself out checking them out. But now here, this is significant because when we're talking about archaeological evidence of Israel in Egypt, what can we expect to find that will identify a people group as Israelite? Right? You see that Abraham entered Canaan in 2091. That's over 2 centuries before Jacob's family goes to Egypt in 1876. It's 215 years. So they dwelled largely in tents in the region, and they were predominantly keepers of livestock. But since Lot, right, like Abraham, he had flocks and herds, and he resided in the city of Sodom. Perhaps other of Abraham's descendants who had flocks and herds also resided in cities. But in any event, you need to see that they lived among the various people groups of Canaan for a long time, for more than 2 centuries. And they no doubt added aspects of Canaanite culture to the Mesopotamian culture that Abraham's family had brought with him. Remember, Abraham comes from Mesopotamia, and he comes into Canaan's land, right? And then he's there for over 2 centuries before they go into... So he has Mesopotamian culture. He now has 2 centuries worth of Canaanite culture, and then he goes into Egypt. And this is before the giving of the Mosaic Law, long before, centuries before. The Mosaic Law is not given until after the Exodus. They come into Egypt in 1876. The Mosaic Law is given after 1446. And why is that significant? Because Paul, he describes the Mosaic Law, right? He calls it in Ephesians 2:14. He says it is a dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles. In other words, the Mosaic Law functioned to isolate Israel from the surrounding cultures, which made them more distinctive. See, after the Mosaic Law, they become more distinctive and thus potentially more readily identifiable in the archaeological record because they are more distinctive. Those distinctives of later Israelite culture were not present in patriarchal life. They weren't present there, and thus they're not available as markers of Israelite presence. So it just makes it harder to go and determine, are these people living here? Are they Israelites? Moreover, given the kindness and the goodwill that Pharaoh showed to Jacob's family when they came in, one can imagine the Israelites being favorably disposed to Egyptian culture. In other words, not being afraid to absorb elements of Egyptian culture because they've been treated fine by the Egyptians. And then when one adds the fact that the Israelites in Egypt engaged in idol worship, it just becomes very difficult to distinguish them by archaeological remains from other Canaanite groups that may have been in Egypt. It's not easy. It can be done, but I want you to see the difficulty of the task. So that puts a different light on the charge. You may have heard people say, well, there's no evidence of Israelites in Egypt. That's not true. There's ample evidence of Israelites. You just have to know how to read it. Right? You have to know how to read. Here's what archaeologist James Hoffmeyer says. Archaeology's ability to determine the ethnicity of a people in the archaeological record, especially of the Israelites at such an early period, is quite limited. Assuming the Israelites were in Egypt during Egypt's New Kingdom, what kind of pottery would they have used? What house plans would they have lived in? What sort of burial traditions did they see? All things that I can access archaeologically. And would archaeologists be able to identify the burial of these early Israelites who ended up as slaves anyway? And how are all these things different from those of Canaanites or other Semitic-speaking peoples in Egypt at this time? So I'm setting you up here to see what the expectation should be. All right? Now, I think you're going to be happy with what's there. But here, let me give you first, here's the big picture. I know the bell's going to ring in 16 seconds, but here's the big picture. You see here, right? You see the delta? It goes down, so you have Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt, Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt, and then you see how the Nile fans out into that delta, and here's a close-up of that delta, and I'm going to be talking a lot at first about the excavations that have been done at this place called Tel El Daba. It is, according to Petrovich, it is the most excavated site in the entire ancient Near East. And there's some really cool stuff here. Thanks for coming. Okay, now 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jeremy asked me for a blurb on the class, and I gave it to him. I don't know where that got put, but in that I said I thought it would take maybe 8 weeks. I don't think that's right. I think we're going to take longer than 8 weeks, but I hope you don't mind. I'm going to keep talking until I'm finished.